Hey everyone, this is James from TDB bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today is a non-drinking episode, and I'm going to be talking about kind of the default posture of skepticism and why I think it's a good idea to adopt that in kind of the Western tea scene towards vendors and towards different tea descriptions and that kind of thing. So this is one of those episodes where I have kind of a loose outline. It's some big ideas, so hopefully I'm able to land the plane and get something out of it. So going to be talking a little more conceptually rather than specifically about teas or whatnot. So in my opinion, one of the best blogs, perhaps the best one to read, and I would strongly recommend people read it start to finish, is Marshall's blog on tea, a tea addict's journal. I've referenced it constant times when I'm writing. I've referenced it in multiple videos. It's an older blog, but he still posts occasionally, a couple times a year maybe, so more than TDB at this point. But one of the reasons it's aged well is, for one, it focuses a lot less on reviews. And reviews, while they can be interesting, they tend to be a little bit less compelling when you're talking about a tea 15 years later that's probably no longer available. But the main reason is that he talks kind of about concepts and things like that. And he's not afraid to call out bullshit. It's a very critical blog. So very critical towards vendors. He's had posts where he's talking about different types of fakes that you're going to run out. It also has a strong connection to Hong Kong and to the tea scene in various places. He's lived in Beijing and other areas as well. So he's a guy that has traveled very well, and currently based in Hong Kong, that just knows the tea scene extremely well. And I think it's definitely the best kind of English-speaking blog of its type. Not afraid of call-outs. So I think demeanor-wise, I'm a little bit of different. I'm not quite a shake-the-boat kind of guy that much. But nonetheless, it's a approach, Marshall's blog, that really, really resonated with me and is very, very influential. I definitely say hugely influential on my personal tea journey. And in many ways, it's kind of the opposite of kind of the Instagram tea scene, which I like, personally. I think it's fine, but it's very, very positive. Whereas, like, Marshall and stuff, you really have to think critically, and it gets into some fairly negative territory where we're calling out vendors for their bullshit. And so, I mean, it's calling the tea scene out basically on different faults or different fakes or things like that gets passed on. And we need that in order to kind of achieve more accuracy and less misinformation, and also just to push people towards drinking better tea, which I think in the end is what that blog pushed me to do, and I think it pushes a lot of people that way too. Which brings me to kind of the core thesis of this video about how the default posture of skepticism is kind of a good way to approach different vendors and different information that you're going to come across in the tea scene. That's not to say that you should treat everything 100% inaccurately. That'd be bad, but I think what I would say is that you should not assume that something is accurate just because it's been spoken to authoritatively by someone that runs a tea shop or things like that. A lot of people will get their information strictly from vendors, specifically like if you go into a tea house or a tea shop or something like that and people are just giving you different information. I think a lot of people are inclined to take that as 100% true when, not all of it is going to be true. Same thing for vendor descriptions and things like that. If you're reading it like, oh man, this has a really interesting story about this guy who found these tea leaves or whatever. And sure, it could be interesting, but you should not treat that story necessarily as gospel or as a way to necessarily buy good tea. I think back to my initial session at a local tea house here in Seattle, which was focused on Taiwanese oolong. And, it was a very talkative older lady, and I would say about 80% of the information that she said is true and moderately helpful, and about 20% of it, looking back, was probably complete bullshit. So specifically a lot of stuff about like health and the body and things like that. So why does she have that misinformation? It's hard to say, because misinformation gets passed a variety of ways, so it's hard to know where to point the finger at specifically. It's possible that someone could just come up with some bullshit and tell it to someone to mislead them and to sell a tea. I tend to think this is probably the minority of the way things get passed on. I'm not inclined to believe that most people are just going to straight up lie to your face. But if we think about how information is passed on, especially when this involves people going to China or Taiwan and bringing back tea, talking to different people along the ways, So information is just going to be passed along person to person in a lot of ways, and maybe somewhere along the line someone stretches the truth, or someone does tell that kind of bald-faced lie, and then that person they told it to treats it as the truth, passes on to the next person, etc., etc., and then at the end, what is everyone left with but something that's not true? And so it's hard to say where the precise malfeasance occurs, but what is true is that there is a fair amount of misinformation. Specifically, if you're shopping for tea online, it runs rampant in a lot of different vendor descriptions. The pu'er scene, I think, has been particularly guilty of this. In fact, I think one of the worst ways to learn about pu'er is if you're just to read everyone's descriptions front to back and take that as gospel. For me, at least, when I'm looking at a vendor description of a tea, most of what I want to know is very basic regional information. So I'm talking about like what county or what larger mountain it's from, and kind of the price and who's selling it. In these vendor descriptions, there's a lot of overselling. You can oversell master. This also can happen verbally in a tea house. You're basically selling a story. There's poetry involved, yada, yada, yada. And I think in general, the more floofy that stuff tends to get, the more you should generally tune it out. While kind of these Chinese legends of origin stories and stuff are interesting, they're not important to kind of the tea that you're going to buy. You should treat it very much like a consumer product in that sense. Many of the best teas, in fact, I'd say just about all of the best teas I've had, I don't recall the specific stories. The tea really spoke for themselves, and it's less about that. And it's more about the people that you are enjoying the tea with, as well as the tea itself, I would say. Okay, so how does kind of this default posture of skepticism kind of bear itself out? Well, one way is, like, let's say a new vendor is introduced. For me, at least, I'm inclined to not treat that vendor as being particularly serious, because there's a lot of the barrier to become a vendor is not particularly high until you have enough information from people outside of that vendor, ideally non-vendors, that are speaking and recommending this person. And at that point, I would start to take it a little more seriously, depending on who is saying what to who. So obviously, that's not something that's possible for someone that's totally disconnected from the tea community and whatnot. And mistakes are going to be made, and that's totally fine. In the past, I do want to flag one video that I did fairly recently, the red flags when shopping for pu'er online. I think that's maybe one that's going to speak a little bit more to the specific indicators and things that you can read on the vendor description that can help for you to flag things that very likely are not true. So, I mean, with the experiences, you're certainly going to get more discerning on what matters and what not. One area that I think I've pointed out in the past that I don't care for at all is microregions. The way that the pu'er world has kind of gone is, we started out and there's like these big areas that people want tea from. So, for instance, Iwu, Wulong. These are big mountains. They have a lot of tea on them. Big areas, rather. So, Iwu. People use it in a variety of ways, but it could be seen as a greater area. But as time went on, people started to focus on specific areas, specific villages, and then even specific gardens. And for me, at least, this is not particularly helpful because as kind of the more granular you get, it's harder to taste those specific things. So, and it's also very, very easy to mislead people. It's hard for me to know, like if someone told me it's a tea comes from 1,000-year-old trees, I'm inclined to say that's definitely wrong and bullshit, but it's hard for me to kind of prove the negative. It's not like I'm going to go all the way to Yunnan and track those trees down and be like, haha, you're wrong. So as a result, there are things that have a distant chance of being right, but really are not. But they're very, very likely bullshit. And so that's what you learn to be better about here. So for me, at least, microregions are one of those things where it's like hard to verify if the tea is even from that microregion. But in the end, it's like if a tea is from this tiny village in Bulong, I'll just treat it like any other Bulong tea. And if it stands out and it's great, fantastic. I love it. But if it's not, then why do I care? And so, information doesn't have to be 100% accurate to even have a tea worth trying. If a tea is probably being misled as far as like tree age or something like that, it could still be worth trying. Absolutely. You just don't take that tree age necessarily as gospel and be like, okay, I only want to taste teas that are 300 years or older in terms of tree age or whatnot, or have like a super specific year. It's like, this tea is definitely from 1985. It's like, well, I'm very skeptical of the exact year of 1985, but it's definitely an old tea, and it could still be worth trying depending on the cost. So there are teas that are too cheap that can be still worth trying, and there are teas that are even too expensive that can be still worth trying too. And there are also kind of appropriate price teas that are still not worth it as well. So hopefully you guys got something out of this little bit of ranting that I have here. There's a lot of stuff that's very possible to be right, but is very unlikely wrong. And so again, it's hard to prove that negative. Looking back about 12, 13 years ago when I was just starting to drink tea, if I were to kind of give myself advice, I would not give myself the advice to be more positive and look for more positivity in the tea scene. I think in the end, it's Marshall and his approach of skepticism and looking critically at different things that still continues to resonate. So that's the advice that I'd like to continue to convey and pass down, because I think it's very smart to kind of stay on your toes when it comes to information and the scene, and not to buy too much into people's bullshit. Okay, hopefully you guys like this episode. Let me know what you think, and I will see y'all next time. Cheers.